Welcome to another Northern Monkeys datasheet review. This time we're looking at the Space Marine Scout Squad and the different detachments and leader you can get for this unit. So the Scouts recently got a new lease of life in the kill team with a bit more of a scale appropriate kit. And these guys are kind of in the background, they're like the newer members of the chapter who haven't quite been given their entire black carapace. And they kind of do the espionage and the stealth roles inside of the Space Marine army, which they do quite a good job of representing in the tabletop. So these are the general stats of the Scout Squad. The datasheet, you get 5 of these guys for 70 points, or you can actually take 10 of these guys for 140 points. I did not know that was a thing. I do not recommend doing it. I've never seen a 10-man unit of these guys used in any significant or meaningful way. I just think it doesn't play to their strengths at all. But what you get for 70 points, they're kind of potentially the cheapest Marine unit for 5 bodies. You do get a slightly worse armour save than normal Marines with a mere 4+ on these guys. But aside from that, the stats are more or less identical. They even get 2 wounds nowadays, which is big, you know. Even though their save might be a bit worse, there's still a 10 wounds that your opponent has to chew through. So they're never going to be insignificant to kill. They have a lot of different weapon options, but generally they're just a kind of decent unit for their cost. Their output isn't really where, and defensive ability, that's not where their strength lies. You'll see some units out there that have like 5 different abilities and they're all really like long and wordy, but Scouts don't have that. But what they do have is probably some of the best possible abilities you could have combined together. So Infiltrators lets them, during the deployment phase, they can deploy anywhere on the board, more than 9 away from the enemy's deployment zone or their units. Now this is a fantastic ability for just being able to have a bit of forward momentum and a bit of forward pressure. One of the few units in the Space Marine army that can do this. And they also get the benefit of the Scouts 6 rule, which is good with them being Scouts. Basically, after you've determined who's going first, you can move them up to the amount of 6. Now this is really good when used with infiltrators, because you essentially, when you're deploying your infiltrators, the worry is that you'll put them too far forward and then your opponent goes first, and just before that unit can do anything, your opponent just moves in and uses them as a springboard, like they move and charge into them and suddenly they've got their unit and missed your lines, or they take over an objective in the mid-board they wouldn't have otherwise been able to reach. But with the Scout 6 ability, you've always got that option to kind of deploy these guys a bit further back for whatever job you want them to do, and then either go forward and do that scoring if you go first, or move back if you go second and kind of be more safe, and you get to preserve them as a utility unit. They also have this guerrilla tactics ability. Basically, at the end of your opponent's turn, if the unit is more than 6 away from all enemy models, you can put them back into a strategic reserve. Now this is great because they don't need to be anywhere near the board edge, they just sort of fade into the mist and disappear, which makes this really easy to use. You don't kind of have to worry about their positioning other than just them being close to enemy units. Now there's lots of ways to manipulate that in Space Marines, in certain detachments, so you're going to always kind of get value out of this, and I think this guerrilla tactics just solidifies them as like the ultimate scoring unit. Early game, they use infiltrators and scouts to kind of get on those objectives, complete secondary missions that other units from your army just might not be able to because of movement, and generally just kind of make themselves trouble for your opponent. But they also, with this guerrilla tactics, that lets them kind of, usually units that infiltrate into the mid-board are like liable to just die because they're always out front. But with guerrilla tactics, as long as they survive your opponent's first turn, generally scouts can just disappear into reserves and come down and cause trouble later on. And don't forget to always look at keywords. These guys have smoke and grenades, which give you access to 2 absolutely great stratagems of the same name. And this just lets the scouts have a bit more damage than people might expect, you know, be able to chip wounds off vehicles or monsters that your opponent has. And smoke is just, against some armies that maybe hit on 4s, this is just an absolutely great ability to have. And you just generally, like, you're way more survivable. Only having a 4-up save, they get a big bonus out of the cover as well. If your opponent doesn't have any AP, they go up to that 3-up save. So yeah, just generally great abilities. Not the most showy, but definitely the most useful. Now, for such a small unit, as we saw previously, these guys actually have tons of different options. You can give them combat knives, the sergeant can have a chainsword, They can have bolt guns, they can have sniper rifles, heavy bolters, missile launchers. There's lots of choice with these guys, but I think there are some correct options. I think the one where you're going to have the most debate is the heavy bolter and the missile launcher. So if we zoom in on these two weapons specifically, it's a tough choice, right? The heavy bolter is generally quite good at hitting enemy infantry. It's got that sustained hit, so it's a little bit more accurate than the 4+ might make you think. AP1, damage 2, it just kind of gives the squad a bit more punch into certain enemies. Whereas the missile launcher, it's only got that one shot, and strength 9, it's not going to do a great deal versus vehicles. However, I think where I really come down on is the missile launcher. I just prefer it. It might not be the popular wisdom, but it's for me the thing that's always done the most work. Now, there's a few reasons for this. Firstly, it's just the heavy bolter's fine, but you're not really lacking for that kind of a weapon in Marines, and I've just found it's sort of a very unreliable thing. While the missile launcher is the same thing, the missile launcher can actually have really good volume with the frag, being able to get blast. It just means that the scouts get a certain punch up into enemy skirmishers, like a 5-man unit of Eldar Rangers or something like that. It just lets you threaten that, and sometimes it doesn't work, obviously you can just miss with it, but other times the frag can just roll really well and suddenly it's oh yeah, this is 6 or 7 shots and you're taking a big chunk out of the enemy unit. And as well as that, I really just often scouts are kind of hiding in the backfield, scoring things behind enemy lines or engage, and just being able to have that one missile shot plink off and maybe do d6 damage to an enemy vehicle. It's quite rare, but I've had these guys literally be the difference between taking down a armiger that was diving into my lines versus not doing, just because of that one crack missile shot made it through. And while it might seem unreliable, if you're firing into the oath of moment target with the rerolls to hit and the +1 to wound, it can be very, very strong. So that's why I always prefer it. In terms of the other war gear, you're generally choosing between combat knives and pistols versus bolters. There's a few different... I don't think you can really go wrong here. I think there's good options on both. I like taking the sniper rifle on this squad. It hits on 3s, so it's relatively accurate, and at AP2, damage 2, it's just really, really high value compared to the no AP 1 damage bolt gun and the combat knife, which obviously requires you to be in melee. I just think it's going to get more value for you over the course of a game. And even if you just fight, you fight with this guy's fists instead of the knife, the sniper rifle shot that came off before that is still high value into a lot of different targets. There is the debate about bolt guns versus knives. I like a chainsword on the sergeant. I think the number of attacks that guy gets really lets this unit be a bit more dangerous against certain very weak chaff. And the combat knives, while you get that AP and stuff, they're good. I just prefer the bolt guns. I think it gives you sort of more volume and more chance to just kind of do those chip shots, a bit like with the missile launcher. And while you don't always want to be using these guys for that, you want to try and keep them safe and preserved as much as possible. I just kind of like the ranged output on them. Now in terms of picking a detachment for these guys, I think they are very agnostic and they don't care about what detachment they're in. Almost any Space Marine detachment is going to get use out of these guys. And for the bulk of them, you get sort of minor buffs. Like for example in Ironstorm Spearhead, you get that detachment ability to give you the reroll, 1 hit, 1 wound. That can be really good for the missile launcher or the sniper, just giving them a bit more efficiency there, letting those weapons spike up a bit more. And in Gladius, the reactive move is really, really nice, just because it might allow you to sort of get away from an enemy that's moved up quite fast into your infiltrating unit and make them have more than a 9-inch charge, which can be good for just keeping them alive as a late game asset. And as well as that, it also lets you potentially, if your opponent was going to get within 6 of you, you wouldn't be able to use your guerrilla tactics ability, but being able to do that, I think it's called squad tactics, reactive move stratagem, it can just get you out of that 6-inch and allow them to disappear at the end of your opponent's turn. Quite good, but as I said, the unit generally just, you can put it in any Space Marine detachment. So the Vanguard Spearhead detachment though, that's these guys' natural home. It's kind of the sneaky guerrilla fighter kind of detachment, and it has some great synergies for them. Now, there's a really cool combo with these guys. With them having Infiltrate and Scout, these guys are the unit that's best poised to take advantage of the Deadly Prize stratagem. This is basically a cool little stratagem that gives you sticky objectives where you can move off an objective and still control it until your opponent takes it away from you. You do this in the command phase, and what's great about scouts is they can kind of infiltrate up early game in deployment phase, and you, with the Scout 6 ability, you know who's going first and second. You can kind of move these guys to kind of tag up one of those early game objectives in the command phase and then move off it. And you can just give you a big primary advantage by just having this objective sat there. Your opponent can't charge onto it because there's no units on it, even though you're holding it. So if you just kind of think about it in the deployment phase and position these guys right, look at where your opponent's units can go, and you can kind of pull off this quite good tactic that lets you hold an objective in no man's land without any risk on your part because of the scouts with their infiltrators and scouts ability. So really, really good and really, really worth thinking about, especially with this unit. Now, they also weirdly, there's also a stratagem in this detachment called Guerrilla Tactics, which lets you, unconfusingly, it puts units back into reserve. You can use this on scouts as well as another unit in your army, like your infiltrators or whatever. The one thing that it's worth mentioning here is that you only have to be more than 3 from all enemy models, whereas the scouts have to be 6 away. So maybe in a niche scenario, you can use it to get them out of dodge, where you might otherwise not be able to with their normal ability. There is also something to be said for the calculated feint stratagem in this detachment. Because they've got the scouts keyword, they get a flat 6 reactive move when your opponent tries to charge them. This just makes any charge quite nebulous for your opponent, unless they've completely enveloped your unit and you can't get away at all, at which point you were doomed anyway, right? You can just always guarantee that they're going to have a 6 on their charge, which is failable. It's very failable these days, with not as many reroll charges like army-wide in the game anymore. And yeah, it's just good to have. It keeps them safe, even if your opponent gets a really long advance and has access to advance and charge. It just might keep them alive in the early game, which is what you want to aim to get value while keeping them alive in the early game, and this is what this lets you do. And the detachment rule as well. Scouts tend to operate on the edges of the battlefield, and having the -1 to hit and always cover if your opponent's more than 12 away from the detachment rule, that's really good for just making this unit slightly more hard to take out at range, even if your opponent's firing something quite significant at them. The -1 to hit and the possibility of having a 5 or a 6 on your save, it's just going to make them slightly less easy to just pick up. And while you're always going to have to test for battle shock and things like that, scouts, just one scout can still get in the back lines and score objectives like deploy teleport homers or establish locust, whatever it's called, stuff like that. So genuinely, while they're good in any detachment, they get particular detachment out of Vanguard Spearhead. So while we've talked about Space Marine units that can have 25 different leaders, now unfortunately for the scouts we can only spare 1 leader. Now I didn't know this guy could lead the scouts. I've never seen them with a leader in them, and I didn't think they could, but when I checked, you can have the captain in Phobos armor. There's a bunch of other guys in Phobos armor that he can lead all sorts of different units, but apparently you can't put a Phobos librarian in scouts. Just the captain in Phobos armor. But since he's the only leader, let's talk about him, even though he might not be a particularly great choice. He's 70 points, so sort of on the cheap end, especially for a captain. The normal captain's about 80 something points. So this guy, he does the standard captain thing of giving you a free stratagem once per battle round, which generally can be alright on the scouts. In Vanguard in particular, where you might want to be using more stratagems like that sticky objectives or things on them more. It's alright to have, save you some points. He gets a kind of meh amount of war gear. His combat knife, it got buffed to be AP1 along with all the other combat knives, and 6 attacks is okay, but realistically you're not really going to do a lot with him. And aside from that, he has this Instigator Bolt Carbine, which is 1 shot at damage 2. It's just kind of nothing. I'd have thought it'd at least be damage 3, or 2 shots, something like that, but no, it doesn't really do anything. Having the precision is okay, and maybe him and the sniper from the scouts unit could kill a weak enemy character, but I feel like the loops that you have to jump through and the odds eventually stack up to make that very, very unlikely. But there are some positives to him, even though he doubles the price of the scout unit. So you kind of, every time, if you were ever going to take this guy to put in your scouts, you'd really have to think about it and go, do I not just want 2 scout units? Maybe you probably do. Notably as well, he doesn't have the Scout's 6 ability, so therefore your unit that has him in, I believe, loses that ability. I could be wrong on that, but I'm not sure. If someone knows the answer to that in the comments, well, please do let me know. Now, he has the Master of Deceit ability. This is kind of his main thing, and it's now been buffed since this data sheet was printed, and it now lets you redeploy any infantry units. Now, this I think is the only real draw of this data sheet. You get to do this after both players have deployed their entire armies and after you know who's going first. So that's quite good because you're just kind of going to be able to take your infantry units and just move them around. Now this includes the scouts that you might have infiltrated up. You know, it means that you're not so reliant on that scout ability and you can be a lot more aggressive with these guys and your other infiltrating units. However, it can just... I just don't think it's worth it. He, specifically as a leader for the scouts, I think he just makes their squad worse. So you kind of just... I don't know. I don't like him. He's a weird character in the game, and he's a weird character on the battlefield. I'd really recommend against bringing this guy in any capacity. So from my general kind of play experience, scouts are probably one of the better units Space Marines have. Now, that comes in a weird context of, like, Space Marines have so many great units that, you know, we talked previously about the Blade Guard combo that will kill anything, how great things like Incursors are, and I believe that's all true, but I think what's great about Scouts is their pure utility. Most Space Marine units, people say they suffer from being a little bit good at everything, therefore they're costed like that, which means they're not quite efficient. It's a weird train of thought, but it does kind of ring true with Space Marines. However, Scouts are just very good at that early games and late game scoring, which is what makes them one of the best Marine units. I think if these guys didn't exist rules-wise, if they'd have been like squatted and not had this kill team brought out for them, Space Marines would be in a much worse place. Just because Scouts are so great. You don't need them necessarily, but if you can spare 70 points, it's the best 70 points you'll be able to do anything within the army, for sure. Being able to move block your opponent early game and kind of stop their own scouts moves. For those that don't know, if you've infiltrated these scouts up 9 away from your opponent's deployment line, and they've got lots of units like Votan, who have loads of scouts of their own, and in terms of the ability, not the unit, they can't move their scout move within 9 of your units. Therefore, you can just kind of block enemies into their deployment zone. Same applies against World Eaters to some degree. And that's really, really strong. And you just generally, later game, you know, you use them for abilities like that and scoring objectives early game, like Cleanse, Establish Locust. And if they can survive and get away with it, then they can then go back into reserves and come in later and score behind enemy lines. And you just have games where the scouts just rack up like 15, 20 victory points, and it's a 70-point unit. Absolutely fantastic. Really recommend these guys. Even just in this picture, you can see from one of my games, my scouts there. This Rogal Dawn, what this Rogal Dawn wants to do more than anything is get moved, and go like 15 inches forward, crash through that wall, and obliterate my like Ballistus Dreadnought and unit of Blade Guard with a character in it that's like hiding on the other side of these ruins. However, these scouts just have walked up to it and charged into him, and it's pinned him in place. You know, Guard lack an ability to fall back and shoot, which means this Rogal Dawn just got blocked there, and it got blocked there. It blew away the scouts on its turn with all its multi-melters and Gatling cannon and things like that, and my scouts are dead. But by then I'd been able to move a unit of Incursors up who, guess what, ran out and did exactly the same thing the next turn. And this big, like, you know, Rogal Dawn that should have piled around the corner and gone into my army and just blown a lot of things away was just sat killing like 140 points of Space Marine chaff over multiple turns. And that's kind of what the scouts do. So you want to keep them alive as much as possible so that your big heavy hitting units don't have to waste their time like deploying and doing secondary missions. But sometimes you have to throw them away, and it's totally fine to, because they're only 70 points. It's kind of their job. And this was 2 scouts that did this after they'd already like brawled and won a fight with a unit of Astra Militarum infantry early game and stopped them from being able to move up and clog up my board. So yeah, I can't sing their praises enough as a unit. They're absolutely fantastic. So thank you for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed. We try and post content like this every week. And yeah, a bit of a longer video than normal, but there's a lot to say about Scouts.